So I've come to realize over the last couple of videos I've made that not everybody who watches this channel is super familiar with the Bible, with all the different parts of it. So I just want to make a quick video sort of explaining how to approach the Bible, which parts of the Bible are what different genres, and how you can understand reading the Bible if you decide to pick it up today. So in the course of this video, I'm going to break the Bible down into its major chunks and give a brief description of all the books that are contained within those sections. Now, over the course of history, lots of different religious groups have had different opinions on which books should be included in the Bible and which ones shouldn't. So if you open up a Catholic Bible, for instance, you'll find 6 or 7 books that aren't in the Protestant Bible. We'll touch on those in a second here. Likewise, if you open up a Jewish Bible, you're not going to find the New Testament at all. A 27-book collection is just not in that Bible. And furthermore, if you look at more elaborate canon lists like those of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, you'll find a lot more books that aren't in anyone else's Bible. So what are we going to use for this video? We're going to focus primarily on the Protestant canon of 66 books of the Bible. Now, don't take this as me saying that the Protestant canon that I use is the one true canon and that all other canons of Scripture are, heretical in some way or another. The reason I'm choosing the Protestant canon to base this list on and this discussion on is because if you pick up a Bible on the street today, most of the time you're going to wind up with a Protestant Bible. So if anybody out there isn't super familiar with the Bible, or if it's just been a long time since you've touched one, I want to use the canon list that you're going to find in most Bibles that you're going to be able to pick up. So with our 66-book Protestant canon in mind, let's take a look at the Bible and evaluate the first major division, the Old Testament on the one hand and the New Testament on the other hand. The Old Testament books were written by the ancient Israelites. These are the spiritual, and in some cases genetic, ancestors of Christians and Jews and other religious systems today. So these books of the Old Testament were composed over a long period of time under many different authors, starting with early, very, very early forms around 1200 BC, starting to pick up more steam around 1000 BC, and more as time goes on. And these books were probably finished in their completed form sometime around the 100s or the 200s BC. So we're talking about from very start to very finish, probably over 1,000 years of development here. All 39 of these books are written in Hebrew, with some sections being written in a related language called Aramaic. While the Old Testament is written in Hebrew and contains 39 books, the New Testament is written in Greek and contains 27 books. These books were written over a much shorter time period. The earliest one pops up around 50 AD, and the last one was probably finished at around 100 AD. So instead of dealing with 1,000 years of development, we're dealing with about 50 years of development. At the same time, too, the New Testament was written by substantially fewer authors, and these authors were all exclusively Christians. There is a continuous story that's told from the earliest of the Old Testament books through the latest of the New Testament books, but there's also a very large gap in between them. This is something that's commonly called the intertestamental period when we're considering biblical history. So essentially, the story told by the Old Testament ends at around 400 BC, give or take, whereas the story of the New Testament picks up around 4 BC. So we're dealing with about 400 years of silence. Now, we have a lot of literature from this intertestamental time period, and we'll talk about a little bit of that at a later time, but it's important to note that if you read the Old Testament and then you suddenly move to the New Testament, you're going to notice that a lot of things have changed. Figures like the Pharisees and the Sadducees and Herod the Great show up on the stage with no antecedents in the Old Testament. Likewise, no longer is Babylon and Persia the big bad guys on the scene, but rather Rome and Greece are the major players. So if you move from the Old Testament to the New Testament, you're going to notice some discontinuities. But the reason for that is because of the 400-year time gap in between them. The Old Testament can be divided up in a couple different ways. The traditional Jewish way of dividing the Old Testament is into the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, from which we derive the phrase Tanakh. And this three-part division of the Old Testament is very helpful, but I'm going to use a slightly modified version of it. I'm going to divide the Old Testament into the Torah, the legal sections, into the historical writings, into the poetic writings, and then into the prophetic writings. The first of these sections is the Torah, and the Torah, sometimes called the Pentateuch, is the fundamental piece of scripture of all Christian and Jewish religion. So it's the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and thus the first 5 books of the entire Bible, whether you're Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, or virtually any other form of Christianity. The Pentateuch begins with the book of Genesis. This is where we get our stories of Adam and Eve, Noah's flood, obviously before these the creation of the world, and also the stories of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This flows seamlessly into the book of Exodus, which begins with the famous Exodus story of the escape of the Israelites from bondage in Egypt. It moves on to the revelation at Mount Sinai, and then the tone shifts a little bit. So everything thus far, from the creation of the world all the way to the arrival at Sinai, has been narrative. They're wonderful stories. A lot of us remember these from Sunday school, but all of a sudden the genre makes an abrupt shift to legal framework. So essentially, we go from telling a story to assigning lists of laws that the Israelites are supposed to be beholden unto. This catches a lot of us off guard, and a lot of modern readers aren't really sure what to do with this information. My recommendation, if you're reading the Bible casually, if you're just looking to know what it's all about, feel free to skim these sections. There's really good meat there. There's a lot of cool stuff going on. I'm going to make videos about all of it, God willing. But if you're just trying to get the story of what's going on, getting bogged down in these details can be really discouraging. So I give you carte blanche ability to pass over them as necessary. There's a pun there. But if you'd like to skim them to get kind of an idea of what's going on, feel free to do so as well. Now, the legal sections continue throughout the next book in the Pentateuch, which is the book of Leviticus. Leviticus is almost entirely legal system. There's some narrative there, but honestly, most Christians these days skip over Leviticus entirely, and you kind of have permission to do so as well. But it picks up again in Numbers. So in the book of Numbers, which is the fourth book of the Pentateuch, the narrative continues. The Israelites depart from Mount Sinai, and they move through the land of the Sinai Peninsula on their way to the promised land of Israel. So we do have some legal sections in Numbers as well. Again, feel free to move by those if you just want the story. But the story picks up from the departure of Sinai to the arrival in the plains of Moab, just outside the promised land of Israel. And that's where the book of Deuteronomy picks up. The book of Deuteronomy is the fifth and last book of the Pentateuch, and it also contains more legal sections as well as narrative sections. It's a bit confusing to move from Numbers to Deuteronomy because Deuteronomy has a different flavor to it. It begins with a very lengthy sort of recapitulation or retelling of the entire story so far, from the Exodus all the way to the arrival at the Promised Land. Then it goes into what appears to be more laws, and it ends with the death of Moses at the eve of Israel's entry into the Promised Land. Deuteronomy is a little bit different for the primary reason that it was written separately from the other books of the Pentateuch. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers essentially all fit together like a glove, whereas Deuteronomy existed on its own for a while before it was eventually incorporated into the other ones, albeit very well. You can see the narrative through lines continue through it. But that's the Pentateuch, which is the primary and first section of the Old Testament. Following the Pentateuch, we get to our next section of the Old Testament, which I'm calling the historical writings. The historical writings basically pick up the story of the Pentateuch and they continue it onwards. So the story of the historical writings begins with the book of Joshua. Joshua is the student of Moses and is seen as sort of Moses' inheritor. It's Joshua that leads the Israelites freed from Egypt into the land that was promised to their ancestors. And he's largely responsible for establishing the nation of Israel, at least in a loosely tribally confederated manner. Following the book of Joshua, we go to the book of Judges. The Judges period is the time frame after the Israelites have entered into the land, but before they've appointed a king for themselves. So there's a lot of important and interesting stories about the fundamental origins of the Israelites in the book of Judges. And honestly, this book is really slept on. But the book of Judges concludes with the claim that basically in that day there was no king and everybody did what they pleased. And so that sets up the problem that the next book in the history solves for us. Following Judges, we move on to the books of Samuel. There's a first Samuel and a second Samuel. I'm going to call it Samuel just to keep things simple here. The book of Samuel begins as the period of the judges comes to an end. The people are tired of not having a king because all the people around them already have a king. Now, the prophets of God tell the people that, look, God is your king. Are you sure you want a human king who's going to tax you and subject you to forced labor and do all these other things? And the people say, yes, we want a king. So the people get a king. And 1st and 2nd Samuel tell the story of the first two monarchies. The story of King Saul, who was the first king of Israel, who later became unfit to rule, and the story of King David, who was the second king of Israel, and is typically seen as sort of the king of Israel that all other kings were compared against in terms of might and faithfulness to God. The books of Samuel conclude with King David on his deathbed, and the question of who will become the next king of Israel is the primary concern of the first part of this. Now, these books are called 1st and 2nd Kings because they're a list of the kings of Israel who ruled during the monarchical period. So it begins with the story of the ascension of King Solomon, David's son, who would become king after him, although he would have to challenge his half brother for that role. Following Solomon, we enter into the period of a divided monarchy, where the kingdom of Israel was split in half from north to south. And the Book of Kings does a really good job of tracking both of these kingdoms as they developed politically and religiously over time. The Book of Kings concludes with the Assyrian exile of the northern kingdom, where the northern kingdom fell to the Assyrians and all of its people were deported into various Assyrian territories, and with the Babylonian exile of the southern kingdom, where the southern kingdom of Israel has betrayed God, and so they've been handed over to the Babylonians, and pretty much their entire population deported back to Babylon. And this is kind of where the large story of Israel sort of ends, at least for a little while. The next books that you'll come across after this point are the books of Chronicles. Now, you might be a little bit confused opening these books because so far, from Genesis all the way to 2nd Kings, we've had a continuous story. Sure, there's been hiccups here and there with the legal sections and the material that's just not very interesting to read, but it's largely chronological order of events from the creation of the world all the way to the end of the Southern Kingdom with the Babylonian exile. But when we come to 1st and 2nd Chronicles, all of a sudden we're back at the beginning again. The story takes a step back, and it retells a lot of the same stories that we found in Samuel and in Kings in particular. So why is this here? It seems kind of redundant. Historically speaking, the reason why Chronicles exists is because when 2nd Kings was finished being written, that was during the Babylonian exile. But several hundred years later, after the exile had ended, the Israelites and some of their scribes sought to sort of retell the story in a way that sets up what happened after the exile itself. And so 1st and 2nd Chronicles set up the next two books which come about, and these books are chronologically next. These are the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah cover the history of the Israelites after the Babylonian exile. So the Babylonians have deported the Israelites back to Babylon, but then the Babylonians themselves fall to the Persians. Under Persian rule, the Israelites of the southern kingdom were allowed to return home, to their very destroyed home, and they undergo the project of rebuilding the land. That's what the books of Nehemiah and Ezra are all about, rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem and eventually rebuilding the temple of God there as well. Chronologically, this is where the story of the historical writings ends, but I do want to mention two other books that take place sort of during some of these events we've been talking about so far. The first of these is the Book of Ruth. Although the Book of Ruth was written in a later period, probably during the Persian period or the Greek period, the Book of Ruth takes place during the Judges period. So it's sort of a side story that goes on during the Judges period, but it's not necessarily in the direct linear line of the rest of the books of the Old Testament that we've talked about so far. So it's placed right after Judges, definitely worth a read, but be aware that it's sort of a side story before you return to the main narrative. Likewise, the book of Esther comes after Ezra and Nehemiah in the ordering of the books, but this is a narrative that takes place roughly contemporarily with the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Although this book isn't concerned with what's going on in Israel, but rather what's going on in Persia. It's a really great read. Definitely recommend that you check it out. But keep in mind that you're going to be taking a step back again all the same. Now, after the historical writings are finished, we move on to another section that I'm calling the wisdom writings. And this is the most diverse section of the Bible so far, because so far the Pentateuch has been pretty well self-contained, and the historical books have been pretty well self-contained. They're all roughly similar in genre and style, so you kind of get the idea of what's going on here. But the wisdom literature draws from a lot of different resources of ancient Israelite philosophy, and so you don't necessarily have to read them in the order that I'm going to present them here. In fact, I'm going to present them a little bit out of order according to the Protestant canon, just to kind of follow things up thematically and make things make sense. So starting off with this out-of-order collection of the wisdom literature is the book of Psalms. Psalms, chapter for chapter, is the longest book in the Old Testament, at 150 chapters long. Now, that being said, some of those chapters are pretty short, though some of them are quite long as well. Essentially, the book of Psalms as we have it is an anthology and a collection of 150 originally separate psalms, which are sort of cultic poetry and ritual songs that have all been gathered together. In the ancient world, there were divisions of the book of Psalms into 5 books of 30 or 3 books of 50, but we have one book of Psalms and it's 150 different psalms long. And very confusingly, these psalms were all taken from different aspects of religious life in ancient Israel and from different periods of religious life in ancient Israel. Some of these psalms probably predate the organized nation of Israel as a whole and were passed on through Israelite thought and came to be conformed to Israelite religious purposes. Other ones were written possibly as late as the Greek period, which even the narrative of the Old Testament doesn't go into. So the book of Psalms, if you just kind of read through it, don't expect a whole lot of chronological ordering, although there are important structures within the book of Psalms. But that being said, the poetry contained in the book of Psalms have inspired Christian and Jewish and other religious thinkers throughout the centuries and even millennia. So it's definitely worth the read. Similar to the legal sections of the Pentateuch, don't feel like you have to take the whole thing in one bite. Between you and me, I've never read the whole book of Psalms all the way through. I've never been a Psalms guy. I have friends who are getting their PhDs in studying the Psalms. Not me. I'm not that guy. So do what you will with it, but it's definitely not a resource to be ignored one way or the other. Moving on from Psalms, we have the book of Proverbs. The book of Proverbs is one of the most easily accessible books of the Old Testament because it's literally just a list of wise sayings. And what's interesting is that a lot of these sayings are religious in character. They're talking about how your relationship to God should be, but a lot of them are just good, you might say, secular advice. Like, hey, when you invest in a business venture, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Invest in 3 or 5 ships, I believe is what the term that the book itself uses is. So the book of Proverbs is sort of a way of teaching wisdom so that you can live a wise life and kind of get by in contemporary culture while still maintaining a good relationship with God. And the cool thing about the book of Proverbs is that it isn't just one monolithic section. It's not like one guy sat down and wrote out 30, I think there's 31 chapters of Proverbs there. It's drawing from multiple different sages from ancient Israel. The sayings of King Solomon, sayings of King Hezekiah, the sayings of King Lemuel, and the sayings of Agur, all gathered together into this sort of compendium. And I think it's really cool when you go from one section to the other, you'll find that different sections have different flavor. Some of them are poetry. Some of them are just like, look, here are the brass tacks of what you need to figure out. It's something that I definitely recommend you read, but if you're reading a section of it and it's pretty dry, flip forward a couple pages. Maybe there's something else waiting for you there. Now, moving on from Proverbs, which wants you to be happy in life, we get the book of Ecclesiastes, which does not want you to be happy in life. It's a bit facetious, but Ecclesiastes is known for being the downer of the wisdom literature because it takes a very, you could say, pessimistic view of life. The author is looking at himself and looking at mortality and realizing, like, I come from nothing. I can take nothing with me when I die. You can strive all day to be wealthy and good and wise, but at the end of the day, sometimes people lose all of that prematurely, whereas fools go on and absorb their wealth in the meantime. It's a really deep book. I'm not doing it justice here. And honestly, this is one of the more challenging books for people who aren't familiar with biblical theology to understand and get through. When you read it, you might be shocked, disappointed, maybe even a little bit depressed. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend spending too much time in this one, as it can be a bit of a downer. But I think that if you read it as a complement to Proverbs, it's a very good way of absorbing the wisdom literature of the ancient Israelites. Like I said, Proverbs tends to be really optimistic. Hey, if you do the right things, life's going to go good for you. And Ecclesiastes kind of says, yeah, but sometimes things don't go well for you, and we have to deal with that. And that's a great segue into the next book of the wisdom literature, which is the book of Job. The book of Job is one of the most readily known books from the zeitgeist, the idea of the righteous sufferer, and yet it's also the most misunderstood, I would say. The book of Job does a lot of different things. I can't cover it all, obviously, in this little video. I'm going to dedicate a whole video to it later. Some of the things that the book of Job does is, well, for one, it evaluates the different forms of wisdom that many of the different ancient cultures believed in. So, for instance, the setting is that Job is this righteous man who was blessed with everything, children, wealth, flocks, houses. He had everything he wanted, and then he loses all of it. And so the question is, has Job done something wrong to warrant this? Or did bad things really just happen to a good person for no reason? That's kind of the fundamental question at stake here. And all of Job's friends come to him and basically tell him, hey, bad things happen to bad people, good things happen to good people, so you must have done something bad. And yet Job proclaims his innocence and says, no, I didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes bad things just happen. And it's literally like 36 chapters of his friends trying to convince him otherwise and Job being obstinate. And then at the end, God shows up and Job asks him, why did all this stuff happen to me? What did I do to warrant all of these bad things? And here we kind of get the answer for Israelite theodicy, the question of why do bad things happen to good people? And essentially the answer is you don't get to know. That might be a disappointing answer, but at the same time, consider that most of the ancients answered this question by saying, well, if something bad happened to you, you must have done something bad in secret, or you must have been impious towards the gods, You might have even done something wrong that offended one of the gods, and you don't even know what it is. And there's no way for you to know what it is. Maybe you stepped on a stick that Apollo liked, and so you're just cursed now. That was typically the answer that most of the ancients gave. So the Israelites, it's kind of a non answer given in the book of Job, but it's also preferable to the sort of fatalism that infused so much other ancient literature, where it's kind of like, did something bad happen to you? Well, you must have deserved it. It kind of acknowledges that, like, hey, sometimes bad things just kind of happen. And on this side of eternity, we don't get to know why that is the case. The book concludes with having us trust God, that God has a plan, and he probably didn't let this happen for no reason. But it also gives us a moment to reflect on, what do we think about our role in the world, our mortality, and how should we live this life as we have it. And if all of that sounded really dry to you, then know that the book that comes after this one is literally a book of erotic poetry called the Song of Songs. This is, as I said, a poetry of ancient romance, and yes, it is exactly what you might think of it as. And so this book has historically been interpreted as being an allegory for Christ and the church, or an allegory for Yahweh's love for ancient Israel. It seems at the end of the day that it literally is erotic poetry in the Bible, but that shouldn't surprise us because God invented sex too. There's probably a whole video to be made on it that I'm too cowardly to make. The point being, I recommend this book exclusively for ideally married people, mature people, especially if I had kids. I'd probably recommend that they don't read this part of it. Not because its contents are bad, but simply because they can be a little bit mature at times, and so it should be enjoyed by a mature audience. So that puts a bow tie on the wisdom literature, but it does move us on to our fourth and final section, which is the prophetic literature. Now, the prophetic literature is the favorite category for a lot of people. I am not one of them. It's confusing, it's dense, and it's really difficult to get through. So let me give you the highlights. There are two subcategories of the prophetic literature. Don't you love subcategories? We have the major prophets on the one hand, and we have the minor prophets on the other hand. The major prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. The minor prophets are 12 in total. Now, the difference between the major prophets and the minor prophets isn't importance. It isn't the case that the major prophets are super important and thus major prophets, and that the minor prophets are less important and thus they're called the minor prophets. The reason there's the major prophets and the minor prophets is because the major prophets wrote really long books and the minor prophets wrote really short books. So the book of Isaiah, for instance, 66 chapters long. The book of Jeremiah, over 50 chapters long. Compare that to the book of Hosea, which is 12 chapters long, or the book of Jonah, which is 4 chapters long. The book of Obadiah, which is in these 12 minor prophets, is 1 chapter long, and it's not even a particularly long chapter. So major and minor is with regards to length. And speaking of which, most of the prophets, including the major and minor prophets together, are ordered in the size of book that is written about them. So Isaiah comes first because it's the longest one. Jeremiah comes next because it's next longest. Ezekiel, so on and so forth. So because of that, chronology gets a little bit mixed up. Isaiah wrote at a very early time. Jeremiah wrote after him. Ezekiel wrote after him. We're on track so far. But then you go to Hosea, and Hosea is older than Isaiah. So lots of confusing stuff going on chronologically here. On top of that, the prophetic literature is also probably the most misunderstood category of ancient literature because a lot of people look to the prophetic literature for prophecies about what's going to happen in modern day. And I hate to break it to anybody who is of that opinion, but these were prophecies that all have come true several thousand years ago. They're still very important for us because if they were just meant to have taken place and then be forgotten about, they wouldn't have written copious amounts of books about them. Again, about a third of a very large Bible consists of the prophetic text. So they still have present application, but it's also not something to go sifting around through to try finding applications to the political circumstances of what's going on today. It really is difficult to recommend a reading strategy for the books of the prophets because it requires so much background information to understand and apply correctly. I would say if you're a casual reader of the Bible, you're welcome to peruse your way through it. I would spend special attention on the book of Jeremiah. It's a bit of a lengthy read, but there's enough biographical and sort of narrative sections of it that kind of holds the whole thing together, and it gives you an idea of the frustration that God and his prophets had with the Israelites, who are his chosen people. So I'd recommend reading through the book of Jeremiah, and then I'd say give Hosea and Amos a read, and then I'd say move on to Zechariah, Haggai, and Malachi, which are the last 3 books of not only the prophets collection, but of the Old Testament as a whole, as I think They're written a little bit later, and they give you sort of a different perspective on where things are at right now. Now, I want to make special note in the prophetic literature of the book of Daniel. So, in Protestant canons and in Catholic canons as well, we put the book of Daniel with the major prophets. So we go Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. In Jewish canons of scripture, they put Daniel with the wisdom literature or with the historical writings. And there's a couple of reasons for this, but to keep it simple, essentially, Daniel is a piece of apocalyptic literature, but it also has large narrative sections. So it's something of an anomaly. It's a cousin of prophetic literature, and it's kind of related to the narrative literature, but it doesn't fit neatly in any one category. And I mean that in more ways than one. We need a Daniel episode because it's confusing as heck. But essentially, what you're getting into with the book of Daniel is 6 chapters of narrative stories about the apocalyptic prophet Daniel. And then you're getting 6 chapters after that of the visions of Daniel. So 6 chapters of stories about Daniel, 6 chapters of visions that Daniel purportedly had. So you get a little bit of a mix of narrative and a little bit of a mix of prophetic literature, but even the visions themselves, those prophecies, are of a different quality from the rest of the prophetic literature that you're going to find. So I definitely recommend giving Daniel a read. It's surprisingly accessible despite being as confusing as it is, but be aware that it's an anomaly in more than one way. So if you walk away from it confused, totally understandable. That being said, it's also one of the most fun and honestly metal books of the entire Old Testament. So happy reading. And that takes us through the Old Testament. So we're going to be moving now into the New Testament. So remember, 400 years chronologically have passed from the end of the story of the Old Testament to the beginning of the story of the New Testament. So when we come onto the stage, we have different actors on the stage. There's been a lot of development politically and religiously in this time period, and so the world looks a little bit different. But a lot of it has the same flavor, so hopefully you're able to carry on without too much difficulty. There's a couple different ways to divvy up the New Testament, but I'm going to divide it up into 4 major sections with one noted anomaly among these. The first major section of the New Testament are the Gospels. These are 4 biographies written about Jesus, and they all tell relatively the same story, but we're going to go through them anyways just so you can know what the differences are from one to the other. Following the Gospels comes our little anomaly in the form of the book of Acts. So the book of Acts is a continued history. It picks up the story after the life of Jesus and into the early period of the church, where it cuts off rather abruptly, and that's the end of the story for a little while here. Following the book of Acts comes the letters of Paul. These are almost half of the New Testament, 13 letters of different length, beginning with the longest one and ending with the shortest ones. So these are the letters written by the Apostle Paul. They're all penned by the same author, and they have multiple different things that they're doing from one letter to the other. Section 3 is what's called the Catholic epistles with a little c, and that means the general or universal epistles. Essentially, these are the letters that the other early Christian leaders wrote. So remember, we have 13 letters written by the Apostle Paul, and then we have 2 letters written by Peter. We have 1 letter written by James, the brother of Jesus. We have another letter written by Jude, who is probably also the brother of Jesus and the brother of James, although there's some debate about that. We have 3 letters written by the Apostle John, the same guy who wrote the Gospel of John, which we'll talk about. So we have 4 books in the Gospels category with 1 book of Acts, which is sort of our anomaly. Then we have 13 books in the Pauline letters category. We have 7 books in the Catholic epistles category. And then we move on to the final and 4th category, which is the Apocalypse category. And this is occupied by a single book, the book of Revelation, which is the last book of the Bible and my greatest fear as somebody who makes religion videos on the internet. So let's start with the Gospels. There are 4 Gospels in this section of the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These Gospels can be further subdivided into 2 subfamilies: the Synoptic family on the one hand and the Johannine family on the other hand. The Synoptic family includes Matthew, Mark, and Luke, whereas the Johannine family includes only the Gospel of John. The reason they're divided up this way is because Matthew, Mark, and Luke, if you read through all 3 of them one after the other, you'll get the same story in 3 different sets of clothing. So essentially, the same story is told with different emphases. Sometimes one will include a story that the others don't. Sometimes one will include a speech of Jesus that the others don't. And all 3 of them are really interesting in their own right. But very clearly, the 3 are related to each other somehow. John, on the other hand, seems to stand apart from the other Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke share about 90% of their content from one to the other. John, on the other hand, shares about 10% of its content with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And 90% of John doesn't show up in the other Gospels. So When you read through Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you might get tired of the same stories over and over again. But then crack open John, and you're going to get a whole different slew of stories, different speeches of Jesus, and a really different theological angle that John is going for. I would personally recommend reading through all four of the Gospels because you'll see that different Gospels have different angles that they're aiming for and different information on the life of Jesus. But if you just had to pick a few of them, I'd recommend starting with the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew has been the favorite gospel of the church for almost the entire time the church has been around. And in addition to being popular and easy to read, the Gospel of Matthew also helps with our connection to the Old Testament by the initial genealogy of Jesus. So the Gospel of Matthew begins with the genealogy. You'll run into these in the Old Testament a lot in lists of, different descendants of different people and where they wind up. And Matthew bridges that 400-year gap from the Old Testament to the New Testament by giving you the genealogy of Jesus going back to that time period. So it kind of ties the two of them together in a really nice way. Then throughout the rest of the Gospel of Matthew, we get all the famous stories of Jesus and all the famous sayings of Jesus. It's probably the most complete gospel and also the easiest to understand by itself. Once you're done with the Gospel of Matthew, I'd recommend, if you want to skip ahead a little bit, moving to the Gospel of John. Like I said, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all related to each other. You get a lot of redundancy in the stories and the sayings, whereas the Gospel of John, you're going from one type of gospel to another type of gospel altogether. It's still a biography, it's still told much the same way, but you'll get a lot more information. So I'd recommend, if you had to pick two, start with Matthew, move to John, but again, I'd recommend reading all four of them. After John, you'll arrive in the book of Acts, which tells the story of the early church after the resurrection and the ascension of Jesus, all the way to, I would say, the middle, early period of early church history. It sort of shuts off rather abruptly. This is a very long book, and it also has the most difficult Greek language of the entire Bible. So if you're reading it in the original languages, you better be a classicist or have a lot of experience with it, because even for me, it's difficult. But if you're going to read through the book of Acts, I'd recommend at least reading the first 5 or so chapters. Ideally, make it through the first half of the book of Acts, but also don't feel like you necessarily have to read through the whole thing if you're just reading casually here. I'd say you definitely want to get into the first missionary journey of Paul, but after that, you start to get into a little bit of a repetitive cycle with things. It's all very important, but it does drag out quite a bit. So read the first couple of chapters and feel free to move on. Following this, we move into the letters of Paul. So we've changed genres here. We've gone from narrative to letters. And when I say letters, I literally mean letters. These are letters that Paul sat down, took his pen, and wrote out from himself to other Christians who are living in another part of the world at that time. Now, there's 13 letters of Paul, and you can break these down in a variety of different ways, but I'm just going to give you the highlights and my recommendations for reading if you're a casual Bible enjoyer. I'd say, although it's the longest of Paul's letters, the book of Romans is probably the most important thing that Paul ever wrote. Others will fight me on that one. I will stand my ground. The book of Romans is basically where Paul lays out the core of Christianity as he understands it in as straightforward a way as possible. So if you want to know what Christianity is all about, I'd recommend reading the book of Romans. And Christians have been doing that for 2,000 years. Like, if you want the core heart of what Christianity is, read the book of Romans. Yes, it's long. Yes, it's also worth it. Now again, Paul wrote 13 books, and if you don't want to read all of them, I would say start with Romans, move on from there to the book of Ephesians. Ephesians is substantially shorter than Romans. It's only 6 chapters long, and it does a really good job of condensing all of Paul's thought and theology that's expressed in most of his letters into a relatively compact form. In fact, if you read Ephesians and read the other books of Paul, you'll find a lot of echoes of Paul's other major ideas expressed in the book of Ephesians. So read Romans for the major ideas, read Ephesians for sort of an epitome or a summary of Paul's major theological points there. I would say, moving on from there, I recommend reading the book of Philippians. And the reason I recommend this is that the book of Philippians was written close to the time of Paul's death. He knows that his death is drawing near. He was ultimately executed by the Romans, and he's writing this letter from prison. And so it's giving Paul's perspective as an old man after a lifetime of worshiping God and serving Christ, as to a retrospect of what he's done and where he's come from, and looking forward to where he's going after he dies. It's a really sobering book, and it's a really... read Philippians. You'll see what I mean. It's a very good read. I would say also, give the book of Philemon a read as well. It's the shortest of Paul's letters, and it comes at the end of the collection of Paul's letters. And this is a short letter written from Paul to a freeman who is a part of the church in the city of Colossae, named Philemon. And in this letter, Paul is essentially encouraging Philemon to welcome back a runaway slave named Onesimus, not as a slave, but as a brother in Christ. So basically, Paul is advocating for the breakdown of barriers between slaves and their owners and saying, no, as Christians, you're actually brothers. It's a really heartwarming letter. It leaves you in suspense because actually we don't know how that story ended. Did Philemon receive his slave back? Did he return him as a slave? We don't know. But it gives you an insight into how early Christianity saw the distinction between slaves and masters and what they thought of that institution as a whole. Definitely worth a read. Following the letters of Paul, we're going to meet the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews occupies sort of a halfway position between the Pauline letters and the Catholic letters. And the reason for that is because in the early stages of the church, many people believed that Paul wrote the book of Hebrews. And so Hebrews was counted as one of Paul's letters. So there was 14 rather than 13 of them. But not all the ancient church fathers were of that opinion. Others believed that the book of Hebrews was written by any number of people. It was very clearly written by an early Christian writer and somebody who was an apostle and thus had authority to write a book included in the New Testament canon. But it doesn't seem to have been written by Paul, as most modern scholars believe. So essentially, one of Paul's traveling companions wrote this book, and it's very Pauline in character. If you like Paul's other writings, then coming across Hebrews, you'll be really familiar with a lot of the ideas, even if Paul himself didn't write it. Now, if you're casually reading the Bible, I would say Hebrews isn't necessarily something you have to read through, but if you are interested in how early Christians and early Jews saw each other from their different religious perspectives, Hebrews is really important for that, because it's written by a Jewish Christian to other Jewish Christians regarding the world of Judaism in light of Christianity, and it's honestly a really good read. Moving on from Hebrews, the book of James was written by James, the brother of Jesus, which is a heck of a title if I've ever heard one. And the book of James is technically a letter. It's like the other letters we've encountered so far, written from one person to others, but the contents of the book of James read more like the book of Proverbs from the Old Testament. It's wisdom. It's trying to instruct people on a proper way to live in a more abstract way than maybe Paul's letters would. I would say James is a must read. If you're reading through the New Testament casually, I'd say stop by, give James a read. It's 4 or 5 chapters long. It's probably worth your time. And if you get bored by it, feel free to move on. But I definitely recommend giving James a read. Moving on from James, we reach the epistles of Peter. So there's a 1 Peter and there's a 2 Peter. And if you want to know how many pages of paper it takes to completely parse out the grammar of 1 Peter, I have the answer, and it's 63. 63 pages is what it takes. Don't ask how I know that. So 1 Peter and 2 Peter are very different books. 1 Peter is very cold and very philosophical. It's not cold, but it takes a step back. It looks at the world from a more concrete angle, and it kind of lays things out in a very clear and consistent manner. So if you like that sort of thing, maybe 1 Peter is a good thing to read. 2 Peter is more personal. It's more messy. It's a little bit more repetitive. The style of the language isn't quite as good, but it's a very apocalyptically charged book. So if you're really into sort of the apocalyptic theology, end times, eschatology, maybe give 2 Peter a read. It's only 3 chapters long, and it's pretty easily consumable. Following this, we have the 3 letters of the Apostle John, 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John. 2nd and 3rd John are very small. You could probably write them on like an index card. They're very short, and they're also difficult to understand if you don't have a historical context of what's going on in the back there. So if you want to read them, feel free to, but if you're a little bit confused as to what's happening, don't feel bad about yourself. 1 John is confusing for other reasons. It's 5 chapters long, and it's very, theologically abstract. You think you'd be able to read it and just get information like, oh, God is light, God is love, don't walk in darkness, things of that nature. But 1 John has been frustrating scholars, and me particularly, for a very long time, because the structure doesn't make any sense. I'm going to rant about this in a separate video on it, but like the 1 John, it's less of a, usually when you have literature written, you start here and you go through the argument and you're here, right? It makes sense. 1 John is a spiral. It just kind of goes round and round in circles. And honestly, my head is going round and round in circles by the end of it. So if you want to read it, good luck. If you like sort of obscure esoteric literature like I do, read 1 John because it's not easy to understand. But that being said, its contents are pretty straightforward, and I'd say it's a pretty good look at what early Christian theology looked like. So give it a shot. And the last book of the Catholic epistles is the little book of Jude. And I'm not kidding when I say little. Like 2 John and 3 John, the book of Jude is 1 chapter long. Now, Jude himself was likely the brother of James and therefore the brother of Jesus. So that makes it a very important early piece of Christian literature. But it's also obscure and rather difficult to understand if you don't have a whole lot of background in ancient Christian literature and theology. So I'd say if you'd like to give it a read, feel free to, but it is one of the more confusing books in the Bible. So be prepared for that. But the good news is that as confusing as Jude is, it doesn't hold a candle to our next candidate because we've exited the Catholic epistles and moved on to the fourth and final category of the New Testament in the apocalypse genre, which is housed exclusively by the book of Revelation. So, how do you recommend somebody read the book of Revelation? I almost want to say don't. I almost want to say that unless you have a good background of what prophetic literature looked like, of what apocalyptic literature looked like, reading the book of Revelation is kind of a bad idea. But I can't make that recommendation because we're in the age of information and you can access it anyways, and I don't want to keep people from information. What I would say reading the book of Revelation is if you're going to read the book of Revelation, read it carefully, slow down. And I would even say don't think too much about things. And I don't say that because I'm an enemy of critical thinking. Rather, I'm saying that because a lot of people make the mistake of reading the book of Revelation and intuiting what things mean and operating on the assumption, oh, I know what's going on here. And that doesn't seem like a very wise way of reading this most confusing of books. I know a lot of Christians who they're really interested in the book of Revelation, but their ultimate attitude towards it is, I don't know what this really means. And I think that's probably the wisest attitude that one can take in approaching the book of Revelation. Now, that being said, I believe that the meaning of the contents of the book of Revelation are ascertainable to us. I believe that with resources, with study, with careful thought applied to it in context, that most, if not all, of the contents of the book of Revelation can be understood by people today. But that being said, this is one of the books that I would recommend if you want to take that challenge on yourself. Read as many resources as you can, ideally as academic and as dense and difficult of books on Revelation as possible, and I can make some recommendations if you would like, and be tentative with your conclusions. One of the worst things we can do, whether we're Christians or atheists or anybody else, is read this very confusing and very difficult to understand book and very technical book and walk away without any meditation on it, thinking, oh, I know what this means. We have to be very careful with it. And Christians are actually charged with that because the book of Revelation makes certain demands of its readers if you're involved in the religion itself. So we want to make sure we're not doing anything we're not supposed to there. But if you're a casual reader of the Bible, reading Revelation, be careful with it. That's the best thing that I can recommend. I'm not worried that your soul is going to be cast into hell or something if you misunderstand it. But I think that if you walk past it and assume you know what's going on there without reflecting, without consulting the 2,000 years of meditation on this most difficult of books, then you might be missing out on something. So that's about all I can say. So, are we clear as mud on everything? Let's recap what we've gone over so far. So the Bible, as we've discussed it today, consisted of 66 books. The first division is between the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament consists of 4 subsections: the Torah or Pentateuch, the historical writings, the wisdom writings, and the prophets. The prophets can be further subdivided into the major prophets and the minor prophets. The New Testament likewise has 4 subdivisions with one anomaly. So we have the Gospels, which are comprised of the 4 Gospels. The anomaly is the book of Acts, which kind of fits in with the Gospels, but kind of deserves its own category. We have the letters of Paul as category 2, and the Catholic letters or general letters as category 3. And finally, we have the Apocalypse category, which is occupied by the book of Revelation. I think this was meant to be a short video that I would just do in a quick 15-minute stint. I hope this was really helpful for a lot of people out there. Like I said, the Bible is a complicated book. There's a lot of moving parts in it, but I think that if you sit down and study it carefully, or at least look at the basic outline of it and work your way through some of the key parts of it, it starts to become a lot more understandable to you. So hopefully this was a help to some of you. If it wasn't, let me know in the comments so I can take corrective measures to it. But yeah, if you made it this far, really appreciate your time. Feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see you all next time. Take care of yourselves and enjoy the Bible.